What if the fight for freedom wasn't fought on open battlefields, but in secret alleys and dimly lit rooms where courage was whispered, not shouted? These resistance and partisan war films capture that hidden world where ordinary people defied empires with nothing but willpower and conviction. Some were banned, others were buried under censorship, but tonight you can watch them free. These are 12 films that refuse to surrender to silence. Number 12. Come and See, 1985. Come and See is not just a war film, it is a scream from the soul. Directed by Ilham Klimov in the final decade of the Soviet Union, it portrays the Nazi invasion of Belarus through the eyes of a teenage boy named Fleora. What begins as youthful patriotism turns into raw madness as he witnesses the annihilation of his village and the moral decay of humanity itself. Klimov filmed with a realism that terrified even his cast. Real bullets were fired, real bombs exploded, and the actors were often not told what would happen next. The lead actor Alexei Kravchenko was so traumatized that Klimov used hypnosis to calm him after certain takes. Soviet authorities nearly shelved the film, fearing it would reopen the psychological wounds of the war generation. For months, its release was debated at government levels before finally being allowed in a limited run. Western critics hailed it as one of the most harrowing anti-war films ever made. It does not glorify victory. It burns with the agony of survival. Watching Come and See is not entertainment. It is endurance. Number 11. The Battle of Algiers, 1966. The Battle of Algiers feels so real that military organizations studied it as if it were a combat manual. Directed by Gillo Pontecorvo, this Italian-Algerian collaboration recreates Algeria's struggle for independence from French colonial rule with unflinching realism. Using handheld cameras and non-professional actors, Pontecorvo made the film look like documentary footage smuggled from the front lines. When it premiered, the French government banned it for being too sympathetic to the rebels and too truthful about the methods of torture used by French forces. French newspapers called it dangerous propaganda, while revolutionaries across Africa and Latin America screened it in secret as inspiration. The Pentagon even used it in the 70s to teach American officers about urban insurgency, proof that truth on film can be more instructive than any textbook. Production was intense. Filmed in the real streets of Algiers, the cast often faced threats from both sides. Some were former fighters themselves, reliving their own trauma before the cameras. Today, the Battle of Algiers stands as one of cinema's most explosive portrayals of occupation and revolt. It shows that freedom rarely arrives clean. It arrives screaming. Number 10. Army of Shadows, 1969. When Jean-Pierre Melville released Army of Shadows in post-war France, audiences turned away. They wanted tales of victory and pride, not bleak portraits of moral exhaustion. But Melville himself had fought in the French resistance and knew that heroism often came wrapped in fear, doubt, and guilt. His film follows a small network of underground fighters whose missions blur the line between courage and cruelty. The muted tones, the long silences, and the deliberate pacing made it feel almost funereal, a memorial to unseen martyrs. French critics in the late 60s dismissed it as outdated and pessimistic, calling it unpatriotic. The film vanished for decades unseen outside a few festivals. In the early 2000s, a restored print resurfaced and audiences finally saw its genius. Critics hailed it as Melville's masterpiece, a story stripped of propaganda and full of humanity. Behind the scenes, Melville battled government censors who feared his depiction of collaboration and betrayal would reopen old wounds. He refused to soften his vision. Army of Shadows is not about winning wars, it is about surviving them with one's soul intact. Its quiet dignity has outlived the flags of victory and the slogans of defeat. Number 9. The Ascent, 1977. From the cold silence of the Soviet tundra came The Ascent, a film that feels carved out of ice and anguish. Directed by Larisa Shepitko, this wartime parable follows two Soviet partisans captured by German soldiers in Belarus during World War II. One betrays his comrades to survive. The other embraces martyrdom. What unfolds is not a tale of battle, but a spiritual confrontation between faith and fear. Shepitko shot in freezing conditions in the real Belarusian snow, demanding authenticity from every frame. The temperature dropped so low that cameras froze solid between takes. Her cast nearly collapsed from exhaustion, but the director insisted they continue saying truth must hurt to be real. The Soviet censors were uneasy. The film's religious symbolism was considered subversive, and its portrayal of moral weakness offended communist ideals of heroism. For months it sat unreleased, gathering dust, while officials debated cutting its ending. When it finally premiered, it stunned critics for its raw beauty and moral weight. Western reviewers later compared it to the work of Tarkovsky, calling it a masterpiece of human endurance. Tragically, Shepitko died in a car crash only 2 years later, leaving The Ascent as her final completed film. Watching it today feels like witnessing her own act of transcendence, an artist reaching for salvation through the suffering of her characters. The Ascent is not just about war, it is about the cost of the soul in a world that has forgotten mercy. Number 8. Canal, 1957. Andrzej Wajda's Canal is one of the most haunting films ever made about the Warsaw Uprising. It follows a group of Polish resistance fighters trapped in the city's sewers as they flee Nazi forces. The title itself means sewer, and that is exactly where the story spends most of its time, in claustrophobic tunnels of darkness, mud, and despair. When it was first released, Polish officials hesitated to support it. They feared it would discourage national pride by showing defeat instead of glory. But Wajda refused to glorify war. He showed it as confusion, exhaustion, and madness. The film's atmosphere is almost hallucinatory, with echoing footsteps and dripping water serving as the soundtrack to hopelessness. Many viewers in Poland wept during screenings, saying it felt too close to the real pain of the occupation. Western critics were astonished. Canal won the Special Jury Prize at Cannes in 1957, making Wajda an international voice of conscience. The production itself was as grueling as the story. Actors crawled for hours through mud-filled sets. The air was so dense that breathing became difficult, yet the realism it achieved was unforgettable. Canal stands as the second part of Wajda's war trilogy and remains a cinematic requiem for lost generations. It does not ask for pity. It demands remembrance. Number 7. The Cranes Are Flying, 1957. Few films have captured the heartbreak of war like The Cranes Are Flying, directed by Mikhail Kalatozov. Released during the Khrushchev thaw, it broke every Soviet cinematic rule by focusing not on soldiers, but on those left behind. The story follows Veronica, a young woman whose lover Boris goes to the front, never to return. Her struggle through loss, guilt, and betrayal mirrored the emotional ruins of post-war Soviet life. Shot with breathtaking long takes and fluid camera movements by cinematographer Sergei Urusevsky, the film was revolutionary in both technique and emotion. Soviet leaders were shocked by its boldness. It was the first time Soviet cinema allowed vulnerability instead of heroism. Yet audiences embraced it with tears and standing ovations. It became the first and only Soviet film to win the Palme d'Or at Cannes, a victory that announced to the world that Soviet art could be both human and universal. Behind the scenes, Kalatozov fought the censors who wanted a patriotic ending. He refused, choosing instead to end with Veronica's silent grief beneath a sky of migrating cranes, a symbol of hope beyond pain. The Cranes Are Flying remains timeless because it understands that war is not just about those who die. It is about those who must keep living. It whispers that love and loss are also acts of resistance. Number 6. Man of Marble, 1977. Andrzej Wajda returned to the theme of resistance 2 decades after Canal, but this time his enemy was not the Nazi occupier. It was his own government. Man of Marble is a daring political drama disguised as a mystery. The story follows a young documentary filmmaker, Agnieszka, who uncovers the suppressed history of a once revered Polish worker turned propaganda hero named Mateusz Birkut. Through interviews and forbidden archives, she learns how the communist state built him up as a symbol of perfection and then destroyed him when he began asking questions. Wajda used this fictional investigation to expose how the government manipulated truth and erased those who challenged authority. The film's production was nearly halted several times by Polish censors who found its parallels to real life too obvious to ignore. Scripts were seized, sets dismantled, and funding withdrawn. Yet Wajda persisted. He shot scenes in secret using discarded film stock and underground crews. When Man of Marble finally premiered in Poland, it electrified audiences. People wept in theaters, whispering that someone had finally dared to show the truth. The regime tried to minimize its impact by restricting screenings, but bootleg copies spread across Eastern Europe like wildfire. The film's legacy inspired a generation of artists who believed cinema could be a weapon of resistance. Wajda later continued the story with Man of Iron in 1981, directly addressing the Solidarity movement. Man of Marble remains one of the bravest acts of defiance ever captured on film, a reminder that oppression doesn't always wear a uniform, sometimes it wears a smile. Number 5. Rome Open City, 1945. At the moment of its creation, Rome Open City was not a film. It was a cry. Directed by Roberto Rossellini while Nazi soldiers still occupied parts of Italy, it was shot in the ruins of a city that had just survived war. Using leftover film stock and ordinary citizens as actors, Rossellini captured raw immediacy that no studio could replicate. The story follows resistance fighters, priests, and ordinary people risking their lives against fascism. Its central scene, the brutal execution of a mother running after her captured son, became one of cinema's most shocking images of human suffering. Italian authorities initially tried to censor the film, fearing it would reopen wounds and expose uncomfortable truths about collaboration. Yet when it premiered, audiences broke into sobs. The world had never seen anything like it. Critics hailed it as the birth of Italian neorealism, a movement that changed filmmaking forever. Behind the scenes, Rossellini worked with the resistance themselves, smuggling reels through checkpoints and editing in secret apartments. The film was banned for a time in certain Catholic circles for its depiction of moral hypocrisy within the clergy. But nothing could silence it. Rome Open City won awards across Europe and inspired future legends like Fellini and De Sica. Its legacy is carved in history as the film that rebuilt a nation's soul from its ashes. It reminds us that even under occupation, art can be an act of rebellion more powerful than any weapon. Number 4. The Grey Wolves, 1978. The Grey Wolves is one of those films that slipped past the radar of mainstream cinema, yet left an indelible mark on those who found it. Directed by Sergei Linkov in the late Soviet era, it tells the story of a small partisan group hiding in the forests of occupied Eastern Europe, hunted by both the Nazis and their own government. The film was a thinly veiled allegory about loyalty and betrayal set against the backdrop of resistance warfare. Soviet officials immediately recognized the danger of its message. It portrayed commanders as paranoid ideologues, sacrificing their men for appearances and truth as something dangerous to possess. Production was plagued by interference. Scenes were cut, entire subplots erased, and the film was nearly shelved indefinitely. Linkov managed to smuggle out a rough cut that circulated through underground film clubs and international festivals. Western critics described it as haunting and subversive, likening it to the tone of Tarkovsky's moral realism. For years, the Soviet press refused to acknowledge its existence. Only after the fall of the USSR did the Gray Wolves resurface, restored, and finally screened in full. What makes it unforgettable is not its battle scenes, but its silences, the moments when exhausted fighters question what they are fighting for and whether the enemy is outside or within. The Gray Wolves speaks to the eternal struggle between conscience and command, the private rebellion of the soul. It stands as proof that even when censored, the truth finds its own battlefield. Number 3. The Two of Us, 1967. Claude Berry's The Two of Us is a small film with a heart large enough to hold an entire era's pain. Set during the Nazi occupation of France, it tells the story of a young Jewish boy named Claude, who is hidden by his parents in the countryside and placed under the care of an elderly man who doesn't know his secret. The old man, played by Michel Simon, is a gruff anti-Semite whose worldview begins to unravel as he grows to love the boy. Berry based much of the story on his own childhood experiences in hiding, lending the film an emotional authenticity that critics immediately recognized. Production was difficult, not for technical reasons, but emotional ones. Simon broke down several times during filming, haunted by his own wartime memories. French censors were uneasy about the film's portrayal of bigotry among ordinary citizens rather than soldiers or villains. For a time, it was delayed by the state board, which worried it might provoke public discomfort. But when it finally premiered, it touched a deep national nerve. Audiences saw themselves not as victims or heroes, but as flawed human beings caught in the moral confusion of survival. Critics across Europe hailed it as one of the most honest films about wartime humanity ever made. The Two of Us is gentle, yet devastating. It reminds viewers that resistance is not always loud. Sometimes it is as quiet as kindness itself, the courage to love when hate is the safer choice. Number 2. The Roundup, 1945. Produced in Hungary at the end of World War II, The Roundup, directed by Miklós Jancsó, is a hypnotic masterpiece of controlled chaos and moral disintegration. Set in a desolate prison camp after a failed rebellion, it follows captured partisans and peasants subjected to endless interrogations, psychological torture, and manipulation as their captors try to extract confessions of loyalty or guilt. Jancsó's camera drifts through long tracking shots, creating a visual rhythm that feels both poetic and suffocating. Each frame is a ballet of oppression where cruelty hides behind procedure and truth becomes irrelevant. Hungarian authorities initially banned the film for portraying power as inherently corrupt. Officials accused Jancsó of undermining national unity by showing both rebels and guards as victims of the same system. Yet foreign critics recognized its genius almost instantly. It became a symbol of artistic resistance, screened secretly in universities and later studied in European film schools for its radical technique. Behind the scenes, the director faced constant surveillance. Scripts were rewritten under supervision. Assistants were interrogated. But Jancsó refused to compromise his vision. He said that the camera must move like time, unstoppable and impartial. The Roundup remains one of cinema's purest expressions of moral decay under tyranny. Watching it is like witnessing history trapped in a loop, a reminder that power never admits guilt. It only repeats its mistakes more efficiently each time. Number 1. Night Train, 1959. Jerzy Kawalerowicz's Night Train is not an obvious war film, yet its shadows belong entirely to the aftermath of resistance. Set on a sleek overnight train cutting across post-war Poland, it begins as a psychological thriller about two strangers sharing a compartment, but soon unfolds into a study of guilt, secrecy, and repression. The passengers carry invisible scars from the occupation, former fighters, informants, survivors, and ghosts, all trapped together in motion. Kawalerowicz built the story as a metaphor for a nation unable to stop moving yet unable to escape its past. When the film premiered, It confused censors who expected patriotic cinema. Instead, they found a tense, quiet meditation on the personal toll of war. Officials considered banning it, but the public response was overwhelming. Critics praised its elegance and existential weight, comparing it to Hitchcock and Antonioni. The production itself was daring. Filmed almost entirely on a moving train, the cast and crew endured suffocating heat from the powerful lights and narrow carriages. Despite its intimate setting, Night Train captured the feeling of a whole society suspended between past crimes and future hope. Over time, it became a cult favorite across Europe, particularly among filmmakers who admired its restrained power. It is not about gunfire or glory, but about the silence that follows, the silence of those who resisted and survived only to wonder what freedom truly means. Night Train ends not with victory, but with reflection. The war is over, but the soul is still traveling. Each of these films carries a torch through history's darkest corridors. They remind us that resistance isn't born only from battlefields, but from memory, from empathy, from truth itself. As you watch them free tonight, ask yourself, what would you risk to stay human in an inhuman time? Like, share, and subscribe to keep these forgotten rebellions alive on screen forever.